Elowen didn't fall in the dramatic way stories like to tell. There was no scream, no crash of overturned goblets. She simply misjudged the last step down from the dais, an ordinary human mistake made in an extraordinary place, and her ankle turned beneath her on the cold marble. For a moment she thought she could fix it by will alone. She pressed her palms to the floor, tried to breathe through the sharp heat that climbed her leg, and told herself she would stand. Pride had become a kind of daily bread for her here, small, necessary, eaten quietly. But her body refused. The pain held her fast, not like a punishment, but like a fact. "I can't move, it hurts," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The hall of Night Court was built for stillness. Pillars rose like pale tree trunks into shadow. Candles burned behind smoked glass so the flames did not flicker too brightly. Vampires sat in curved rows along the walls, their attention a physical pressure even when their faces were calm. They had been listening to petitions in voices low enough to be almost private, as if the air itself might bruise. Elowen's whisper should have vanished into that hush. Instead, the entire room changed. Not because everyone suddenly cared, but because someone permitted care to exist there. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved from dark stone that looked older than grief, the Vampire King lifted one hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the smallest interruption, 2 fingers raised, palm angled slightly toward the court. Yet it cut through the room more cleanly than any shout. Conversation stopped. Even the candles seemed to hold their breath. The king did not rise. He did not come to her. He remained a distant presence, as he always did, the sort of figure you felt rather than understood. His voice traveled without strain. "Bring her a chair." There was a pause, as if the order needed permission from the world to be real. Then movement. Soft footsteps. A young attendant in a grey sash, vampire, judging by the way he moved like water, appeared at Elowen's side with a low-backed chair and a folded cloak. Another brought a small brass pan of warmed stones, the kind placed beneath feet in winter. No one spoke. No one questioned. The room held its silence like a vow. Elowen's cheeks burned hotter than her ankle. She had not wanted this kind of attention. She had not wanted the court to see her as fragile, as a misplaced thing. But a different kind of dignity flickered in her, quiet and stubborn, the dignity of accepting help without groveling for it. She let them lift her carefully. She did not apologize. She did not make a joke to soften her own embarrassment. She sat, jaw clenched, hands folded in her lap, breathing through the pain with the calmness she had practiced in 100 small humiliations. From the throne, the Vampire King said only, "Let her breathe." And then, without commentary, without softness that would have felt like condescension, the court resumed as if compassion had always been part of the rules. That was what silenced everyone, Elowen realized later. Not his power. His restraint. The simple fact that he had made space for a human body to matter, in a room that had not been built with humans in mind. She did not understand it. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty at least had a shape you could brace against. This was something else, a quiet allowance. Hours earlier, before her ankle betrayed her in front of immortals, her day had begun the way most of her days did, in the service corridor outside the East Kitchens, with the smell of bread that was never meant for the royal table. Elowen had been ordinary before the palace. A potter's daughter from a river town, hands always dusted with clay, hair always trying to escape its pins. When the treaty was signed, inked between human lords and the vampire crown. She had been selected as part of a living bridge. A handful of humans offered positions inside the palace to prove peace could be practiced, not just declared. Some called them guests. Some called them hostages. Elowen had learned that names could be a kind of cage, too. In the palace, she was a keeper of daylight things. That was the official phrase, spoken by the steward with a straight face on her first day. It meant she tended the rooms that vampires rarely used, the glass house where pale herbs grew under filtered sun, the linen closets where the cloth smelled like soap instead of old stone, the corridor of stained windows that caught dawn and turned it into amber. It also meant she carried warmth with her in small ways, a kettle kept ready, a shawl offered to another human servant, a lamp trimmed so it wouldn't smoke. None of it felt heroic. It was simply how she stayed herself. Her first difficulty had been simple and constant: cold. The palace was beautiful in the way a mountain lake is beautiful, clear, still, and indifferent to your comfort. Marble underfoot pulled heat from bones. Hallways stretched so long that a person could feel lost inside their own footsteps. Vampires did not shiver. They did not fuss over drafts. They preferred quiet, and the quiet had teeth if you let it. Elowen's ankle had been sore for weeks, a small grievance from climbing stairs with baskets, from hurrying when she shouldn't. She told herself it was nothing. Humans always tried to be nothing in places where they didn't belong, because taking up space felt like a risk. That morning, as she filled a pitcher with warm water for the glasshouse seedlings, Mara found her rubbing the joint with quick, guilty fingers. Mara was older, a human cook with flour in the creases of her hands and courage hidden under complaints. "That's not nothing," she said, nodding toward Elowen's ankle as if it were a misbehaving child. "That's you pretending you can be stung." Elowen forced a small smile. "I can't be the only one asking for changes." Mara snorted. "You think asking is shameful? That's your trouble." It wasn't only shame. It was fear, quiet, practical fear. Fear of being reminded, with politeness sharp as a pin, that she was here by permission. Fear of becoming a problem. Mara stirred a pot and spoke without looking up. "We're not asking to move the moon. We're asking for rugs in the service corridor so our feet don't go numb. We're asking for a brazier that burns in the mornings. We're asking to be noticed as people." Elowen listened as if the words were a warm cup placed in her hands. She wanted to believe in that kind of asking. Yet when the steward passed later, Lord Seneschal Vald, all ink dark robes and precise expression, Elowen kept her eyes lowered and her mouth closed. Not because Vald was unkind, but because kindness from those in power could turn without warning into disappointment, and disappointment could become exile. Even so, Elowen's work drew her into small conversations that mattered. In the glass house, she often found Lysander, a young vampire attendant assigned to catalogue the palace archives. He had the careful patience of someone who valued order, but his curiosity was the kind that made him linger near the filtered light as if trying to remember something. He never stepped into full sun. The amber panes muted the day into something safe, but still, Elowen noticed the way his fingers hesitated near the warm metal of the window latch. One afternoon, as she pruned pale basil and tied it to a stake, Lysander asked, "Does your river freeze in winter?" "It does," Elowen said. "Not every year, but sometimes. The ice makes a sound at night, like the river is speaking through its teeth." He considered this, eyes turned toward the gold-washed light. "I have never heard a river freeze." "You haven't missed it," she said gently. It's beautiful, but it can also be lonely. Everything held in place. Lysander glanced at her then, as if he understood loneliness as a practiced art. It was in these moments that Elowen felt her own inner struggle most clearly, the desire to harden, to become untouchable, and the quieter desire to remain tender enough to be real. She did not want to live like a guest afraid to scuff the floor. But she also didn't want to become bitter, counting every slight, sharpening herself into something the palace would eventually reject. So she practiced a different kind of courage. She learned the palace's rules, not to obey them blindly, but to move within them without shrinking. She walked steadily instead of rushing. She spoke plainly without raising her voice. She offered kindness without begging for it to be returned. When a human boy named Thomas, one of the younger errand runners, was caught taking extra bread from the kitchen stores, the matter could have ended with his dismissal. The steward's office was efficient that way, clean cuts, no mess. Elowen happened to be delivering herbs when she heard Thomas pleading in a whisper that shook. His mother was ill in the servants' quarters, he said. He hadn't meant. Mara stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face tight with anger that was mostly fear. No one wanted to be associated with trouble. Elowen's first instinct was to step away. To let it pass. To tell herself that survival required silence. Then she remembered the moment on the marble, the court's hush, the king's small raised hand, the space made for her pain without spectacle. She remembered how it felt to be seen as a person rather than a mistake. She stepped into the room. I'll repay it, Elowen said, voice steady. From my wages. And I'll take responsibility for him in the mornings. If he's late, if he fails his duties, it's on me. The steward looked at her for a long moment, measuring. Behind his calm expression, Elowen sensed the palace's larger question, how much humanity could be allowed before it became inconvenient. Finally, Vold said, do not make promises you cannot keep. I won't, Elowen replied. Her hands were cold, but she didn't let them tremble. Thomas did not look at her until they were outside. When he did, his eyes were wet with something like relief and shame tangled together. Why would you do that? Elowen thought of her own pride, the way she'd tried to be nothing. Because you're not nothing, she said. And because if we all pretend we can stand alone, we'll freeze. After that, she became, unintentionally, someone people came to with small worries. A seam ripped, a headache that wouldn't leave, a message that needed carrying without drama. She didn't have power, but she had steadiness, and steadiness could be a kind of shelter. Still, she avoided thinking about the Vampire King. She had seen him only a handful of times in passing, always at a distance, always surrounded by the careful choreography of the court. He was not a figure of romance in her mind. He was law. He was history. He was the reason the palace existed as it did, the reason humans inside it measured their words. And yet, the memory of that day in the hall followed her. After the injury, she was given 2 days to rest. By decree, the steward said, as if rest were a formal matter. A healer came, an elderly human woman named Sister Halin, sent from the nearby abbey to tend to the human staff. She wrapped Elowen's ankle with herbs that smelled like pine and bitter mint, and instructed her to keep weight off it. Elowen hated the helplessness. She hated needing others to carry her tray, to fetch her water, to slow down their work because she was slower now. Her pride rose up again, familiar and sharp. Sister Halin watched her struggle to stand on the 3rd day and said quietly, you think dignity means not needing anyone. Elowen swallowed. Doesn't it? No, Halin said. Dignity means you don't lie about what's true. Pain is true. Limits are true. So is love, if you let it be. Love was a large word for a palace like this, but Elowen understood what the healer meant. There were other forms of care, steadier, smaller. When Elowen returned to her duties, she did so with a cane carved from smooth ashwood, provided without comment. She moved through the corridors more slowly, and in that slowness she noticed things she had missed, the way vampire servants placed their steps so softly that dust never stirred, the way human workers gathered near the kitchens for warmth, shoulders nearly touching, the way the palace itself seemed to listen. The quiet mystery of the place did not feel threatening anymore. It felt like a language she was learning, one she could speak without giving up her own tongue. A week later, Lord Vald summoned her. Elowen's stomach tightened as she stood in the steward's office, the cane steady under her hand. She had done nothing wrong, she told herself, but the old fear returned anyway, the fear of being deemed inconvenient. Vald unfolded a sheet of parchment. There is to be a revision of the service schedules, he said. And of the heating allocations for the human quarters. Elowen blinked. Heating allocations. A brazier will be installed in the east service corridor for morning hours, Vald continued, as if reciting inventory. Rugs have been approved for the stairwell leading to the kitchens. And the human quarters beneath the glass house will receive an additional coal ration weekly. Elowen stared at him, not understanding. Why? Vald's gaze flicked up, brief and unreadable. It has been deemed reasonable. Reasonable. Not charitable. Not sentimental. Reasonable. A warmth spread in Elowen's chest that had nothing to do with braziers. She felt the slow lift of something she'd carried for months without naming it, the weight of believing her comfort was always too much to ask. She hesitated, then said, "Who deemed it reasonable?" Vald's mouth tightened by a fraction, as if he disliked gossip even in the form of gratitude. His Majesty heard a petition. Elowen's throat went dry. A petition from whom? Vald did not answer directly. He simply looked down at his parchment and said, "You may go." She left the office with her cane tapping softly against the stone, heart moving in a careful rhythm. She did not know who had petitioned. Mara, perhaps, with her blunt courage. Sister Halin. Someone who had finally said the words Elowen had swallowed. Or, an uncomfortable thought, perhaps the king had noticed for himself, in that moment when she lay on the marble and whispered that she couldn't move. It wasn't the kind of attention that made her feel owned. It made her feel accounted for. There was a difference, and Elowen held it close. That evening, she walked to the glass house slowly, savoring the new rugs beneath her feet even before they were officially laid. She found Lysander there, standing near the herb shelves with a book tucked under his arm. He watched her approach and inclined his head, polite as always. "Your step is steadier." "It will be," she said. "Eventually." He glanced toward her cane. "The palace can be unforgiving to those who bruise." "It can," Elowen agreed. Then, surprising herself, she added, "But it can also change." Lysander's expression remained composed, but something softened around his eyes. "Change is slow here." "I know," Elowen said. "That's why it matters when it happens." She moved among the plants, checking the soil, the stakes, the small daily signs of life continuing despite stone and shadow. Her ankle ached, but it was a manageable ache now, a reminder rather than a prison. As she worked, she thought about the kind of courage she had always admired in stories: swords drawn, banners lifted, enemies defeated. That courage seemed loud in her memory now, and oddly far away. Here, in the palace of a vampire king, the courage that mattered was quieter. It was Thomas returning the bread he'd taken, then working twice as hard without bitterness. It was Mara teaching a new kitchen girl how to stretch the dough so it didn't tear, muttering complaints like blessings. It was Sister Helen tending human aches without asking anyone's permission to be compassionate. It was Elowen herself, learning to ask for what was needed, learning to accept what was offered, learning not to disappear. When she finished, she paused at the stained glass window that turned the last of the day into honeyed light. Beyond it, the sky was pale, nearly colorless. The palace's outer walls held the world at a careful distance. Elowen rested her hand against the warm metal frame and let herself feel what she had been too proud to feel before, that she was still afraid sometimes. That her place here was still uncertain. That she missed the river and the simple mess of her old life. And also, equally true, that she had grown. She was no longer only enduring. She was choosing. She turned back into the corridor, cane tapping softly. Far away, deeper in the palace, she could sense the court preparing for night. She would not be called to the hall again soon. She did not seek the king's notice. She did not build fantasies around a throne she could not touch. Instead, she carried her small warmth forward, a kettle filled, a rug unrolled, a boy forgiven, a petition spoken aloud somewhere by someone brave enough to speak it. In the quiet that followed her footsteps, Elowen felt something settle inside her, not triumph, not certainty, but a steady peace. The palace remained mysterious, ancient, and unlike her. Yet as she walked, she no longer felt like a mistake inside it. She felt, simply, like a person. And that was dignity enough.